Nancy Ewalt arrived at the Clutter House just after 8 on Sunday morning, November 15th, 1959. She had come to pick up Nancy Clutter for church, the way she had dozens of times before. But when she knocked on the side door, no one answered. She knocked again. The house stayed silent. Susan Kidwell stood beside her on the porch. The two 16-year-old girls looked at each other, uncertain. Nancy Clutter never missed church. The Clutter family never slept this late. Nancy Ewalt opened the unlocked door and called inside. Still nothing. The girls stepped into the kitchen. The air felt cold. Everything looked orderly, undisturbed, but something about the stillness didn't sit right. They moved through the first floor, calling out names. No response. Then Nancy Ewalt climbed the stairs to Nancy Clutter's bedroom. She opened the door and froze. Nancy Clutter lay on her bed, fully dressed, eyes closed. Nancy Ewalt spoke her name. No movement. She stepped closer and touched her friend's hand. It was cold. The girls ran from the house and drove to the nearest neighbor. Within 20 minutes, Sheriff Earl Robinson and 3 deputies arrived at the property. Robinson entered through the same side door the girls had used. He walked through the kitchen, noting the neatness, the lack of disruption. Then he climbed the stairs. Before we continue, if you're finding this story compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us tell these stories with the care and respect they deserve. The Clutter family had lived on this farm outside Holcomb, Kansas, for nearly 2 decades. Herbert Clutter, known to everyone as Herb, had built River Valley Farm into one of the most respected operations in Finney County. He ran 400 acres of wheat and milo, employed a rotating crew of farmhands, and kept detailed records in a small office at the back of the house. He was 58 years old, a college graduate, a former county agricultural agent, and a member of the Kansas State Board of Education. Bonnie Clutter, his wife of 26 years, had struggled with recurring depression for much of her adult life. She spent many of her days in her bedroom on the first floor, managing what energy she had for small tasks and occasional family gatherings. The house had been designed with her condition in mind. Her bedroom sat on the ground floor, separate from the children's rooms upstairs, giving her the quiet she needed. Their daughter Nancy, 16, was a straight-A student at Holcomb High School. She played clarinet in the band, served as president of her 4-H club, and taught neighbor children to bake pies on weekends. She had a steady boyfriend, Bobby Rupp, and a reputation for kindness that stretched across the county. Teachers described her as reliable. Friends described her as the kind of person who remembered birthdays and offered help before anyone asked. Kenyon, 15, was quieter than his sister. He spent much of his time in the basement workshop his father had built for him, constructing furniture and repairing small machines. He was lean, thoughtful, and more comfortable with tools than with conversation. His teachers noted his mechanical aptitude. His friends noted his dry humor and his willingness to listen more than he spoke. 2 older daughters, Beverly and Eviana, had both married and moved away. Beverly lived in Kansas City. Eviana lived closer, in Illinois. On this Sunday morning, neither of them had any reason to suspect what had occurred overnight in the house where they had grown up. The Clutters attended the First Methodist Church in Garden City every Sunday. Herb often led community meetings. Nancy sang in the choir. Even Bonnie, on her better days, attended services with the family. Their absence from church this morning was the first signal that something had broken the family's steady rhythm. Sheriff Robinson moved through the upstairs hallway. He checked Nancy's room first. She lay on her bed in a cotton nightgown and socks, her hands bound in front of her, a cord around her neck. He moved to the next room. Kenyon's bed was empty. Robinson descended to the first floor and found Bonnie Clutter in her bedroom, also bound, also motionless. Then he walked to the basement. Herb Clutter lay on a mattress box in the furnace room, his hands tied, his ankles bound. A few feet away, Kenyon lay on a couch in the adjacent playroom, similarly restrained. Both had been shot. Robinson climbed the stairs and stepped outside. He radioed for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. By 9:30, the first KBI agents arrived. They secured the property and began photographing the scene. Investigators moved through each room, cataloging what they saw. Nothing appeared stolen. No drawers had been emptied. The television remained in the living room. Bonnie's jewelry sat untouched on her dresser. Herb's billfold, containing several bills, lay on a desk in his office. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Every door had been unlocked. Every window remained latched from the inside. The lack of disruption puzzled the investigators. Whatever had happened here, it had not been chaotic. The scene suggested control, precision, and a motive that had nothing to do with typical robbery. Special Agent Alvin Dewey arrived from Garden City shortly before noon. He had known the Clutter family personally. Herb had served on civic boards with him. Nancy had babysat his children. Dewey walked through the house slowly, observing the details his team had already noted. The selective searching, the unforced entry, the methodical restraint of each family member in separate rooms. This was not the work of impulse. By early afternoon, the investigation had already begun. The evidence suggested the intruders had arrived sometime after 10 o'clock Saturday night. Bobby Rupp, Nancy's boyfriend, had left the Clutter house around that hour after watching television with the family. He told investigators the house had been normal when he departed. Lights on in the living room, Herb reading in his office, Nancy walking him to the door. The intruders had entered through the unlocked side door, the same door Nancy Ewalt would use the next morning. They moved through the house room by room, waking each family member. Herb was taken to the basement furnace room. Bonnie remained in her first-floor bedroom. Nancy and Kenyon stayed in their upstairs rooms. Each was bound with cord. Each had tape placed over their mouth. The search had been selective. Investigators found drawers pulled open in Herb's office, papers shuffled, but nothing scattered across the floor. The office safe stood open, empty. Herb had told colleagues he never kept much cash at home. Bonnie's purse contained a small amount of money, untouched. The television, the radio, Bonnie's jewelry, all remained exactly where the family had left them. At some point during the night, each family member had been killed. Herb and Kenyon were shot in the head at close range with a shotgun. Nancy and Bonnie were also shot, each in their respective rooms. Shell casings were found near each body. The weapon had been a 12-gauge shotgun. Investigators documented the placement of each victim, the condition of the restraints, the angles of the wounds. The scene told a story of systematic execution, not frenzy. By mid-morning Sunday, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation had assembled a full team. This was not Garden City's first homicide, but it was the first that involved an entire family killed in their home, with no apparent motive. Alvin Dewey stood in the basement furnace room, studying the space where Herb Clutter had been found. A bare mattress box lay on the concrete floor. Herb's glasses sat on a nearby shelf, carefully placed, not dropped. His wrists had been bound tightly enough to leave marks, but the cord had been tied with care, not rage. Dewey noted the details in his notebook. Then he walked upstairs to Herb's office. The desk drawers had been pulled open, their contents examined but not dumped. File folders remained in neat stacks. Dewey opened the safe. It was empty, just as Herb's friends had predicted it would be. Herb Clutter had been a man of routine and caution. He paid most bills by check. He rarely carried more than $30 or $40. Dewey had verified this with Herb's business partners that morning. He moved to the living room and examined the doors. No scratches on the locks, no pry marks on the frames. Whoever had entered this house had either been let in or had walked through an unlocked door. Dewey interviewed the farmhands. They confirmed that Herb sometimes left doors unlocked, especially the side kitchen door. It was a small town. People trusted their neighbors. Outside, deputies combed the property for tire tracks. They found fresh impressions near the driveway, but the dirt was too dry to cast clear prints. A cigarette butt lay near the garage. Dewey ordered it bagged. Then he returned to the house and stood in the hallway, trying to reconstruct the sequence. 4 people, all in separate rooms, all bound before they were killed. This suggested at least 2 intruders, possibly more. By Sunday evening, investigators had interviewed Bobby Rupp for the 2nd time. He repeated his account of Saturday night. He had arrived at 7:30, watched television with Nancy and Kenyon, spoken briefly with Herb in the hallway, and left at 10. Herb had walked him to the door and reminded him to drive carefully. Bobby's account was consistent, his alibi solid. He was 17 years old and visibly shaken. Dewey ruled him out as a suspect by Monday morning. The first major break came from a neighbor 2 miles east of the Clutter property. She reported hearing a shotgun blast around midnight Saturday. She had assumed someone was hunting. Another neighbor, closer to the house, had seen a car parked near the Clutter driveway late Saturday night, but hadn't thought to note the make or model. The timeline began to sharpen. Midnight. A single shotgun blast heard from a distance. Then silence. Dewey returned to the basement. He studied the positioning of Herb's body again. The mattress box had been dragged from a storage area to the center of the furnace room. Someone had prepared this space before bringing Herb downstairs. That suggested planning, not improvisation. Dewey ordered his team to catalog every item in the basement. 2 hours later, they found a length of cord in the storage closet that matched the cord used to bind the victims. Whoever had done this had brought some materials, but had also used what they found in the house. On Monday afternoon, the autopsy reports arrived. All 4 victims had been shot at close range. Herb and Kenyon had been shot in the head. Nancy and Bonnie had been shot in the head as well, but Nancy had also been shot in the chest. The medical examiner noted that the tape over each victim's mouth had been applied before death. The restraints had been tight, but not violent. There were no defensive wounds on any of the victims. This confirmed what Dewey had suspected. The family had been subdued quickly, perhaps at gunpoint, then restrained before being killed. Dewey convened his team Tuesday morning. They reviewed the evidence so far. No forced entry. Selective searching. Minimal cash taken, if any. 4 victims killed execution style in separate rooms. No witnesses. No clear suspects. The crime suggested knowledge of the family's routines, but it also suggested desperation. Whoever had done this had expected to find money, and had not. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation issued a public appeal for information. Within 48 hours, more than 200 tips flooded the office. Most were irrelevant. A few pointed to drifters seen near Holcomb in recent weeks. One caller reported 2 men asking about the Clutter family at a diner in Garden City on Friday night. Dewey sent deputies to follow up. The diner owner remembered the men vaguely, but could not provide descriptions detailed enough to be useful. On Wednesday, a break came from an unexpected source. Floyd Wells, an inmate at Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, contacted investigators. He told them he had worked briefly as a farmhand for Herb Clutter 10 years earlier. While in prison, he had shared a cell with a man named Richard Hickok. Wells claimed he had told Hickok about the Clutter family during casual conversation, mentioning that Herb kept a safe in his office and sometimes had large amounts of cash on hand. Wells said Hickok had been released from prison in August. He had mentioned the Clutters again shortly before his release, asking specific questions about the layout of the house and the location of the safe. Wells admitted he had exaggerated the amount of money Herb kept at home, trying to impress his cellmate. Now, hearing about the murders, he believed Hickok might have acted on that information. Dewey reviewed Hickok's prison records. Richard Eugene Hickok, age 28, had been convicted of passing bad checks. He had served time at Lansing and been paroled in August 1959, just 3 months before the murders. His last known address was in Kansas City. Dewey ordered a background check and dispatched 2 agents to locate him. The investigation expanded. Dewey learned that Hickok had a history of petty crime, failed businesses, and impulsive behavior. He had been married twice, both marriages ending in divorce. He had worked sporadically as a mechanic, but rarely held a job for more than a few months. Friends described him as charming but unreliable. Former employers described him as intelligent but careless with money. Floyd Wells provided another name: Perry Edward Smith. Wells said Hickok had mentioned Smith as a potential partner for various schemes. Smith had also been incarcerated at Lansing, serving time for burglary. He had been paroled earlier in 1959. Wells did not know where Smith was living, but said Hickok had spoken of him often, describing him as someone willing to take risks. Dewey requested Smith's prison file. Perry Edward Smith, age 31, had a longer criminal record than Hickok: burglary, parole violations, petty theft. He had spent much of his adult life in and out of institutions. His file included psychological evaluations noting a volatile temper and difficulty maintaining relationships. Unlike Hickok, Smith had no fixed address and no known family ties in Kansas. By Thursday, investigators had confirmed that Hickok and Smith knew each other. They had met in prison and corresponded after Smith's release. Dewey obtained copies of letters Smith had written to Hickok from various locations across the western states. The letters were rambling, often mentioning plans to make money quickly. One letter, dated October 1959, mentioned meeting Hickok in Kansas City soon. Dewey issued bulletins to law enforcement agencies across the region. Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were now persons of interest in the Clutter murders. Descriptions went out: Hickok, medium height, dark hair, distinctive facial features from a car accident years earlier. Smith, shorter, stocky build, muscular, often wearing cowboy boots. Both men were considered armed and dangerous. Richard Hickok had been born in Kansas City in 1931, the only child of working-class parents. His father worked as a railroad employee, his mother as a homemaker. The family moved frequently during Richard's childhood, settling in various small Kansas towns before returning to Kansas City when Richard was in his teens. His parents described him as bright but restless, capable of good grades but rarely applying himself. In high school, Hickok excelled at sports. He played football and basketball, earning recognition for his athleticism. Teachers noted his quick mind and his ability to charm adults, but they also observed a pattern of cutting corners and avoiding responsibility. He graduated in 1949, but declined a scholarship offer to attend junior college, choosing instead to work as a mechanic. At 19, Hickok married his first wife. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Friends later said he had been unprepared for the responsibilities of married life, spending money recklessly and working only when necessary. After the divorce, he moved back in with his parents and took a series of short-term jobs, none lasting more than a few months. In 1950, Hickok was involved in a serious car accident. He suffered facial injuries that left permanent scars and a slightly asymmetrical appearance. The accident also seemed to mark a shift in his behavior. He became more impulsive, more willing to take risks. He began passing bad checks, small amounts at first, then larger sums. He was arrested twice in 1956, convicted both times, and sentenced to a term at Kansas State Penitentiary. At Lansing, Hickok adapted quickly to prison life. He worked in the print shop, kept his cell orderly, and maintained friendly relationships with guards and inmates alike. Other prisoners described him as someone who talked constantly about plans for the future, schemes to make money, ideas for businesses that never materialized. He served his full sentence and was paroled in August 1959. During his final months at Lansing, Hickok shared a cell with Floyd Wells. Wells had worked briefly for Herb Clutter a decade earlier and spoke often about the farm, exaggerating details to pass time. Wells mentioned that Herb kept a safe in his office, that he sometimes had $10,000 or more in cash on hand. Hickok listened carefully. He asked questions about the layout of the house, the location of Herb's office, the routines of the family. Wells later said he thought Hickok was just making conversation. After his release, Hickok returned to Kansas City. He moved in with his parents, found work at a body shop, and resumed contact with Perry Smith. The two had met in prison years earlier and had stayed in touch through letters. Hickok described Smith as someone willing to act on plans that others only talked about. In October 1959, Hickok wrote to Smith, suggesting they meet in Kansas City. He mentioned an opportunity that could set them both up financially. Perry Edward Smith had been born in Nevada in 1928, the third of 4 children. His father was a rodeo performer, his mother a full-blooded Cherokee who struggled with alcoholism. The family moved constantly, following rodeo circuits across the western states. Perry's childhood was marked by instability, violence, and neglect. His parents separated when he was young, and the children were placed in various orphanages and foster homes. At the Catholic orphanage where Perry spent several years, nuns disciplined him harshly for wetting his bed, a problem that persisted into his teens. He later described beatings and humiliation that left him wary of authority figures. His school records noted frequent absences and poor academic performance, though teachers observed that he was intelligent and unusually artistic for a child his age. Perry's father eventually took custody of the children and moved them to Alaska, where he worked as a hunting guide. Perry, then 13, worked alongside his father, learning to hunt and survive in harsh conditions. But his father was volatile, prone to violent outbursts, and dismissive of Perry's interests in art and music. Perry ran away at 15 and spent the next several years drifting through the western states, taking odd jobs and occasionally joining his father for hunting expeditions. At 16, Perry enlisted in the Merchant Marine, lying about his age. He served 2 years before being discharged. Then he joined the Army, hoping for structure and stability. He was deployed to Korea during the war and served with distinction, earning commendations for his performance under fire. But after his discharge in 1952, he struggled to adjust to civilian life. He drifted again, working as a ranch hand, a dishwasher, a manual laborer. In 1956, Perry was arrested for burglary in Kansas. He had broken into a store with 2 other men, stealing a small amount of cash and merchandise. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 to 10 years at Kansas State Penitentiary. At Lansing, Perry spent much of his time in the prison library, reading books on history, philosophy, and music. He taught himself to play the guitar and wrote songs in his cell. Other inmates described him as quiet, moody, and quick to anger when insulted. Perry met Richard Hickok at Lansing in 1957. The two became friends, bonded by their shared sense of being outsiders and their mutual interest in schemes that promised quick money. Hickok admired Perry's physical toughness and his willingness to follow through on plans. Perry admired Hickok's confidence and his ability to talk his way out of difficult situations. Perry was paroled in 1959, months before Hickok. He moved to Nevada, then to Texas, then to Mexico, working odd jobs and sending occasional letters to Hickok. In one letter, he wrote about feeling restless, about wanting to settle somewhere but never being able to stay long in one place. He mentioned a motorcycle accident that had left him with chronic leg pain, a constant reminder of the injuries he had sustained years earlier. In October 1959, Perry received a letter from Hickok proposing they meet in Kansas City. Hickok described a plan to rob a wealthy farmer in western Kansas, a man who supposedly kept a safe full of cash in his home. Hickok assured Perry the job would be simple, that they could be in and out quickly, that no one would be hurt. Perry was skeptical, but he agreed to meet. He arrived in Kansas City in early November. On November 14, 1959, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith left Kansas City in a 1956 Chevrolet sedan that Hickok had purchased on credit weeks earlier. They drove west across Kansas, stopping briefly in Emporia to buy supplies. At a hardware store, Hickok purchased rope, tape, and gloves. They continued west, reaching Holcomb by late evening. They parked the car on a side road near the Clutter property and waited until after 10 o'clock. Hickok had described the layout of the house to Perry based on what Floyd Wells had told him. They approached on foot, entering through the unlocked side door. Once inside, they moved through the house, waking each family member and restraining them in separate rooms. Hickok searched Herb's office, finding the safe open and empty. Perry searched the rest of the house, finding minimal cash. The realization that there was no large sum of money created tension between them. According to later testimony, they argued quietly about what to do next. Perry wanted to leave. Hickok insisted they had come too far to leave empty-handed. At some point, the decision was made to kill the family. Hickok later claimed Perry pulled the trigger. Perry later claimed Hickok did. The evidence suggested both had participated. After the killings, they gathered what little cash they had found, left the house, and drove east toward Kansas City. By Sunday afternoon, while investigators were still processing the Clutter crime scene, Hickok and Smith were already 500 miles away. They stopped briefly in Kansas City, then continued south toward Texas. Hickok had a vague plan to reach Mexico, where he believed they could disappear. They stopped in Oklahoma City, then Tulsa, using the stolen cash to buy gas and meals. In Tulsa, they stopped at a diner. A waitress later remembered two men who seemed nervous, who paid in small bills, who left quickly without finishing their food. From Tulsa, they continued south into Texas, then crossed into Mexico near Laredo on Monday morning. They spent several days in Mexico City, staying in cheap hotels and selling small items they had taken from pawn shops along the way. But Mexico offered no refuge. They had little money, no plan, and no contacts. By Wednesday, they had decided to return to the United States. They crossed back into Texas and drove west toward Arizona. In Phoenix, they stopped at a post office where Perry hoped to collect mail. There was none. They continued west to California, then north into Nevada. By Thursday, investigators in Kansas had identified them as suspects. Bulletins had been issued to police departments across the western states. Descriptions of the car and the two men were broadcast on radio and distributed to highway patrol units. Dewey coordinated with law enforcement agencies in Texas, Arizona, California, and Nevada, tracking reported sightings. On December 30th, 1959, 6 weeks after the murders, a Las Vegas police officer named Francis McCauley stopped a car matching the description of Hickok's Chevrolet. It was parked near a downtown intersection. McCauley approached and asked the driver for identification. Richard Hickok handed over his license. McCauley radioed for backup. Within minutes, 2 more officers arrived and detained both men. Perry Smith was in the passenger seat. He answered questions calmly, giving a false name at first, then admitting his identity when officers produced photographs from the Kansas Bulletin. Both men were taken into custody without resistance. A search of the car revealed a shotgun wrapped in a blanket in the trunk. McCauley noted the weapon's make and model, then contacted the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Alvin Dewey received the call that evening. He boarded a flight to Las Vegas the next morning. By the time he arrived, Hickok and Smith had been separated and placed in holding cells. Neither had confessed. Both had declined to answer questions without attorneys present. Dewey met with Las Vegas detectives, reviewed the arrest report, and examined the shotgun recovered from the car. The weapon was a 12 gauge, consistent with the one used in the Clutter murders. Dewey ordered ballistics tests. Then he arranged for Hickok and Smith to be extradited to Kansas. On January 2, 1960, both men were flown to Garden City under heavy guard. They were booked into the Finney County Jail and placed in separate cells. For 3 days, Dewey and his team questioned them separately. Hickok maintained that he had been in Kansas City the night of the murders. Smith said nothing, staring at the wall during interrogations. Dewey presented evidence: the shotgun, the car, witness statements placing them in the area. Still, neither man confessed. On January 6th, Dewey tried a different approach. He told Hickok that Smith had already confessed and implicated him. It was a calculated bluff, but it worked. Hickok's composure broke. He admitted being at the Clutter house, but insisted Smith had pulled the trigger. Dewey moved immediately to Smith's cell and repeated the tactic in reverse. Smith, hearing that Hickok had blamed him, began to speak. He took a breath and said he was ready to tell them what happened. He started with a quiet sentence. "I'll tell you what happened. All of it." Perry Smith sat across from Alvin Dewey in the interrogation room, hands folded on the table. He spoke slowly at first, describing the drive from Kansas City to Holcomb, the wait in the car until the lights in the Clutter house went dark, the walk across the empty fields. He described entering through the side door, finding Herb Clutter asleep in the downstairs bedroom, waking him at gunpoint. According to Smith's account, they had forced Herb to show them the safe. When Herb opened it and they found it empty, Hickok had become agitated. Smith said they searched the rest of the house, finding only small amounts of cash in Bonnie's purse and in Nancy's room. The total came to less than $50. Hickok had insisted there must be more. Herb had assured them there wasn't. Smith described how they had moved each family member to separate rooms and bound them with rope and tape. He said Herb had remained calm throughout, speaking quietly, asking them not to harm his family. Bonnie had been too frightened to speak. Nancy had asked what they wanted. Kenyon had said nothing. Then Smith described what happened in the basement. He said he and Hickok had argued about whether to leave. Hickok had wanted to eliminate witnesses. Smith claimed he had initially resisted, but that something had shifted in him when he stood in that furnace room looking at Herb Clutter lying bound on the mattress box. He said he picked up the shotgun and fired. Then he moved through the house and killed the others, one by one. Dewey listened without interruption, taking notes. When Smith finished, Dewey asked specific questions about the timeline, the weapon, the layout of the house. Smith's answers matched the physical evidence investigators had documented. He described details only someone who had been present could have known: the placement of furniture, the color of the tape, the fact that Herb's glasses had been removed and set carefully on a shelf. In a separate room, Richard Hickok gave a different account. He admitted being at the house and participating in the robbery attempt, but he insisted Smith had done all the killing. Hickok said he had been in another part of the house when he heard the first shotgun blast. He claimed he had tried to stop Smith, but that Smith had been in a rage, methodically moving from room to room. Hickok described himself as horrified, unable to intervene. Dewey compared the two confessions. The basic facts aligned. Both men had entered the house, restrained the family, searched for money, and left after the killings. But each blamed the other for pulling the trigger. The physical evidence could not conclusively determine who had fired which shots. What mattered legally was that both had participated in a felony that resulted in 4 murders. Under Kansas law, both could be charged with capital murder. On January 8, 1960, formal charges were filed. Richard Eugene Hickok and Perry Edward Smith were each charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The trial was scheduled for March. The trial opened on March 22, 1960, in the Finney County Courthouse in Garden City. The courtroom was packed with reporters, local residents, and family members of the victims. Security was heavy. Both defendants sat at the defense table, Hickok in a dark suit, Smith in slacks, and a shirt borrowed from the county. Neither looked at the gallery. The prosecution was led by County Attorney Dwayne West. He outlined the case methodically, describing the timeline, the evidence, the confessions. He called witnesses who had known the Clutter family, establishing their routines and their reputations. He called the medical examiner, who testified about the cause of death for each victim. He called investigators who described the crime scene, the lack of forced entry, the selective searching. West introduced the shotgun recovered from Hickok's car. Ballistics experts testified that the weapon was consistent with the one used in the murders, though they could not make a definitive match due to the nature of shotgun pellets. West presented the confessions, reading portions aloud in a steady voice. The courtroom remained silent as he described how each family member had been killed. The defense attorneys argued that both men had been coerced into confessing, that the interrogations had lasted for hours without adequate rest or legal representation. They challenged the admissibility of the confessions and requested they be excluded from evidence. The judge reviewed the interrogation records and ruled that the confessions had been obtained lawfully. They would stand. The defense then attempted to introduce psychiatric testimony. A psychologist who had evaluated both men testified that Smith showed signs of severe mental disturbance, including paranoid ideation and difficulty controlling violent impulses. The psychologist noted Smith's traumatic childhood, his history of head injuries, his chronic pain from the motorcycle accident. He suggested that Smith had diminished capacity at the time of the murders. Under Kansas law, however, the standard for legal insanity was narrow. The prosecution argued that Smith had known the difference between right and wrong, that he had participated in planning the robbery, that he had taken steps to avoid detection afterward. The judge instructed the jury that mental illness alone did not constitute legal insanity. The jury would have to determine whether Smith had been capable of forming intent. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Hickok and Smith both testified. Hickok maintained that Smith had acted alone in the killings, that he had been horrified by what Smith had done. Smith testified more quietly, acknowledging his role but describing a dissociative state, a feeling of watching himself from a distance. He struggled to explain why he had done it, saying only that something had broken inside him in that basement. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. On April 5, 1960, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. The judge scheduled the sentencing hearing for 2 days later. At sentencing, the prosecution requested the death penalty. West argued that the crimes had been committed during a felony, that they had been premeditated, that 4 innocent lives had been taken without justification. He asked the court to consider the impact on the community, the loss to the families, the calculated nature of the killings. The defense asked for mercy. They cited Smith's mental health issues, his traumatic upbringing, his honorable service in the Army. They noted Hickok's lack of prior violent offenses. They argued that life imprisonment would serve justice without taking 2 more lives. The judge delivered the sentence on April 7th. Both men were sentenced to death by hanging. They were transported immediately to the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing to await execution on death row. Richard Hickok and Perry Smith spent the next 5 years on death row. They were housed in separate cells in a wing reserved for condemned prisoners. They had limited contact with each other and spent most of their time in isolation. Hickok read extensively, wrote letters to his family, and maintained a detailed journal. Smith played guitar, drew sketches, and wrote songs. Both men filed multiple appeals. Their attorneys argued procedural errors in the trial, inadequate representation, and constitutional challenges to the death penalty itself. The Kansas Supreme Court reviewed the case twice and upheld the convictions both times. Federal appeals followed, reaching the United States Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. During their years on death row, both men gave extensive interviews to author Truman Capote, who was researching a book about the murders. Capote visited them regularly, recording their accounts and their reflections. The interviews provided additional details about their lives, their motivations, and their psychological states. Capote's book, published in 1966, brought national attention to the case and sparked debates about capital punishment and the nature of criminal justice. In the Kansas State Penitentiary, Hickok remained outwardly composed. He corresponded with his family, particularly his mother, who visited when she could. He expressed regret for the pain he had caused his parents, but rarely spoke about the Clutter family. Guards described him as cooperative and detached. Smith was more volatile. He cycled through periods of depression and anger, occasionally refusing meals or visitors. He painted and drew in his cell, creating artwork he sent to his remaining family members. In his final years, he wrote long letters to Capote, reflecting on his childhood and the choices that had led him to death row. On April 14, 1965, after all appeals had been exhausted, the state of Kansas set an execution date. Richard Hickok and Perry Smith would be hanged shortly after midnight on April 14th. Witnesses included law enforcement officials, prison administrators, a small number of reporters, and representatives from the Finney County Attorney's Office. No family members of the victims attended. The execution was carried out according to Kansas protocol. Hickok was led to the gallows first, just after midnight. He declined to make a final statement. The procedure was completed within minutes. Smith followed shortly after. He also declined to speak. Both men were pronounced dead before 1 o'clock in the morning. Their bodies were released to their families for burial. Alvin Dewey, who had led the investigation, did not attend the execution. He had retired from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation by then and was living quietly with his family in Garden City. When asked about the case years later, he said only that justice had been served according to the law and that his thoughts remained with the Clutter family. Nancy Clutter had planned to attend the University of Kansas the following fall. She had been accepted into the nursing program and had begun saving money from her weekend baking lessons. Her friends remembered her as someone who made others feel valued, who could turn an ordinary afternoon into something memorable. Her 4-H club established a scholarship in her name, awarded annually to students demonstrating kindness and leadership. Kenyon Clutter had been building a hope chest for his sister Beverly in the weeks before his death. The unfinished piece remained in the basement workshop after the murders. Beverly eventually retrieved it and had it completed by a local carpenter. She kept it in her home for the rest of her life, a reminder of her brother's quiet generosity. Bonnie Clutter had struggled with depression for years, but those who knew her best remembered her warmth during her better periods. She had maintained correspondence with friends across Kansas, writing thoughtful letters and remembering small details about their lives. After her death, several of those friends gathered the letters and preserved them, evidence of the care she had shown even when managing her own pain. Herb Clutter had built River Valley Farm into a model of modern agricultural practice. He had mentored young farmers across Finney County, offering advice on crop rotation, soil management, and sustainable practices. After his death, the Kansas State Board of Agriculture established an award in his name, recognizing individuals who advanced agricultural education. The award has been presented every year since 1961. The Clutter house remained empty for months after the murders. Eventually, it was sold to a family from out of state who had no knowledge of its history. They lived there for several years before moving. The house changed hands multiple times over the following decades. Today, it is privately owned and not accessible to the public. The community of Holcomb, Kansas, struggled in the immediate aftermath of the murders. Residents installed new locks, left lights on at night, traveled in groups. The sense of safety that had defined small-town life felt permanently fractured. But over time, the community rebuilt its routines. The high school continued. The churches remained full. Neighbors continued to help neighbors. In the years since, the Clutter murders have become a landmark case in American criminal justice, studied for their investigative methods, their legal proceedings, and their cultural impact. But for those who knew the family personally, the case has always been about 4 people whose lives were taken without justification, whose absence created voids that could never be filled. The investigation that followed the Clutter murders demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated law enforcement and the importance of persistence in tracking suspects across state lines. But it also raised questions that remain relevant today. How do communities protect themselves from crimes that occur without warning, in places where trust has always been the norm? What safeguards can prevent violence rooted not in personal grievance, but in desperation and miscalculation? The case revealed the dangers of misinformation. Floyd Wells's exaggerated stories about the Clutter family's wealth set in motion a chain of events that ended in 4 deaths. It demonstrated how casual conversations in prison can carry consequences far beyond their context. And it showed how 2 men, neither with a history of violent crime, could escalate from robbery to murder when a plan collapsed. For the families of the victims, for the investigators who worked the case, and for the community of Holcomb, the Clutter murders remain a reminder that some losses cannot be measured, some wounds do not fully heal, and some questions have no satisfying answers. If this story has given you something to think about, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video. These stories matter, and your support helps us continue telling them with the care they deserve. Thank you for watching.